have our bellies full. We'll talk about user experience and accessibility. So the first thing that I would like to say today is that there is no such thing as bad accessibility. There's only inaccessibility. When we make something that is not catering for somebody's accessibility needs, for them it becomes inaccessible. It not become just like a bad user experience or just difficult to use. A lot of the times it becomes impossible. So we have a lot of experiences and examples in the world of things that are not accessible, and even a lot of the tasks that we do day to day and things that we take for granted, for a lot of people without us thinking or realizing it, they're very, very difficult to achieve or even impossible to achieve. And that a lot of the times is, the reason of that a lot of the times is that they are made to be inaccessible. Not because anybody is malevolent or evil, just because there is a lack of thought as to those accessibility needs. And we often do disregard needs that are not our own, as we are humans and we tend to do. A good example of this is the battle against the plastic straws. So we all agree generally that plastic straws harm the environment, but in removing plastic straws without solutions that go beyond sort of paper, metal and glass, we are actually removing the only way that some people that can't swallow or some people that have germ-related OCD can consume food and drink. So when we rush to kind of make a decision on changing something without listening to what others need, and things that may look like weird or stupid products sometimes on the internet, the reason to be is because they serve an accessibility purpose, and without those, people with specific accessibility needs wouldn't be able to do a task. So why do we make things inaccessible? One of the first items or thoughts with making things inaccessible is our own personal biases. So we tend as humans to kind of reflect our own experience or our understanding, limited understanding of somebody else's experience into the way that we see the world. If we prioritize that bias and kind of convince ourselves that we know what this is like, instead of listening to a diverse number of people, a diverse group of people that may have accessibility needs that are different to our own, then we are creating solutions that are really not suitable for them. And when we sort of prioritize that bias, instead of listening to them purely to sort of rushing to demonstrate that we care about accessibility without doing that due diligence, then it becomes performative and it becomes something like this gentleman doing a talk about accessibility and having stairs to kind of go up the podium. So the sentiment is really good behind it, but we haven't actually cared enough to listen and to make decisions based on what we've heard. So if we actually do listen and we actually research a bit or take into account what people say, two other blockers that we tend to have, or another blocker that we tend to have, is the lack of flexibility or the rigidity that we have in sort of putting solutions forward. A lot of the times when we talk about accessibility with websites, there's a certain nervousness that if we do a lot of accessibility stuff on the website, we will negatively impact or cause a detriment to things that are perceived as important or a priority, such as aesthetics, design, the appeal for people who don't have these different accessibility needs or have more mainstream ones, costs as well, which a lot of the times are not our decision, but there's a certain nervousness about that. But the truth is that accessible products and accessible websites do offer a really wide range of benefits that are not to the detriment of these things. Because your website is accessible, it doesn't need to look ugly. Because your website is accessible, it doesn't need to put people off that have different accessibility needs. So if we understand that, that blocker would disappear. The other sort of blocker kind of related to that as well is that sometimes because of that rigidity or that sort of reluctance to change or reinvent things to make them accessible, we try to kind of shoehorn something that's accessible or a feature of accessibility into a website or a design or a product that already exists. And we end up creating things that are less accessible, less successful, and actually more costly than we would otherwise have. Adding accessibility to websites doesn't always mean, or to any product by that matter, it doesn't always mean having to throw everything away and start from scratch. But it means that we have to challenge what's there and we have to be open to changing it. There's a lot of reasons why we make things inaccessible, but the other two that I want to highlight today are lack of visibility and single focus. So we've all heard by now that not all disabilities are visible, but like in the previous talk we heard, a lot of the time when we talk accessibility, we have disability in mind, but that's not the case. There are a lot of accessibility needs that are not necessarily associated to a disability. For example, when we talk about overcrowded websites that are difficult for people who are neurodiverse to use, neurodiversity is not always a disability. Colorblindness is not a disability. Experiencing brain fog when you are in a crisis situation is not a disability, but it impacts accessibility. And related to that, we sometimes look at accessibility from a single focus perspective. So we say, oh, how are people who have visual impairments and motor impairments going to browse our website? We will look at color contrast, and we will look at keyboard navigation or voice navigation. But that's not the be-all and end-all, because sometimes doing these things means that we are making the website less accessible for other people that have different needs. So if we look at, as I said, overcrowded design, but also if we look at icons that may be shared only by people of the same background or the same generation or the same culture, but not by others. Or if we look at animations that can trigger somebody's epileptic seizures, or somebody who has visual impairments, and because that animation is going on up here, they can't see what's going on up there. Or autoplay videos, for example, they became very popular once upon a time, a few years ago, but a lot of people didn't stop to think how you're using users' data without their consent. And when you have things like poverty playing a part in accessibility, that becomes really, really important. Other things that are not disabilities but affect accessibility would be age, literacy, computer literacy or otherwise, speaking English as a second language, things like that. So we need to focus on an array or a spectrum of needs rather than choosing the one thing that we're going to focus on and then neglecting everybody else. So how can we cater for all of these many, many things and not sort of end up mad or without budget or any of these things are sort of negatively impacting the information that we're putting out there? So we use qualitative research. A lot of the times, qualitative research is kind of regarded as something that may be a bit subjective because you're talking to a small group of users, you're talking one-to-one, so that could be their opinion and theirs only. But if you put qualitative research versus quantitative research, and that's the only thing that you're going to do, qualitative research is going to always give you a much, much better understanding of what your audience needs, because it gives you the opportunity to go more in depth and understand what is the root of the problems. And it also prevents you biasing people with pre-selected options that they can choose from. We also iterate and keep up to date. Research has an expiry date. What you find out in December 2019 has no bearing in July 2020. The world changes at a very, very big pace. What you found before ChatGPT does not apply to what you will find out today. So you need to keep researching and keep looking into your users, their behaviors, what's important to them, their frustrations, what they struggle with, and keep tools that you've spent money on and actually spend effort on, like user personas and user journeys, keep them up to date. These are tools that you should be using all the time when creating content. And if they're 3 years old, your content is going to be 3 years old as well. We recruit often, we recruit often and recruit well. Research is an ongoing exercise. Recruitment is also an ongoing exercise. If you cannot do research at a certain point, what you can do is keep building your database of subjects that you can research. You can ask people if they're interested in being contacted for research. You generate that sort of wealth of profiles. The more that you do this, the more varied the profiles are going to be. And you can do that via the website, you can do that via email marketing, social media, so you can see on your database that you have a good balance of very diverse users to choose from. And when that is not an option, you can use external systems that are usually paid, but you can give them profiles of users to use for research, including users with specific accessibility needs. And then the other thing that's very, very important, because we're talking about accessibility and we're talking about charities where a lot of the time we service users that may be vulnerable or in vulnerable positions, is safeguarding. We need to make sure that everybody is safe when we do research and when we speak to them. And that's a collaborative exercise between the researcher or the agency that research or whatever kind of person carries that exercise, and the charity that knows everything about the users that we'll be interacting with. Now you can move on. So what's in it for you? If you look at accessibility, a lot of the times when you have to pitch accessibility to somebody who's paying the bill, they're like, do we need to do these? Like, with all the best intentions, but we only have this amount of budget. I've talked about the very many benefits of accessibility. When you look at content accessibility, be it things like people who have English as second language, literacy, reading comprehension, time wealth, so people who are time poor, and the question and answer mental models that people use the internet for, you get better SEO rankings, you get improved discoverability, so people coming across your organization and your content more easily, and you get vulnerable users who are able to read and understand the content and act upon the information that you've given them. When you look at user interface design, we look at things like color contrast, we look at things like content architecture, universal graphics and icons, supporting text, uncluttered interfaces. You get the renowned Core Web Vitals and the site performance being improved. You have, again, improved SEO and discoverability, and you have more satisfactory user experiences. And when somebody has a positive experience, they're more likely to return, they're more likely to convert, they're more likely to not abandon the website. Some more things that are in it for us, just a couple more. Oh, yeah, functional accessibility. So keyboard and reader browser navigation, elements that are easy to interact with, code that follows best practice, and adherence to usability heuristics. Very fancy word to say, just usability principles. Again, better performance, better Core Web Vitals, and reduction and avoidance of frustrations, which, as opposed to a good user experience, is what makes people leave the website and vow to never come back. And also an easier and most cost-effective website to maintain and to grow. And finally, in terms of architecture and signposting accessibility, we're talking about information architecture, about navigation that is adapting to changing user needs and behaviors, local menus and breadcrumbs, and signposting throughout all your content network, so you don't have a piece of content that only lives there, and unless you go there, you're not going to find it. You have a network of content that sort of interrelates. You have, again, content that's easier to discover. You have people who have who spend more time exploring the website and less time doing the tasks that they're meant to do. And also, you meet those user needs and reduce those frustrations, which ends up with a more positive user experience of your website. And that's it.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.